Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. This week, we're coming at you with a review for two new records. We're going to be talking about the new album from Billy Woods in association with Preservation. Is that who's doing the production? Okay,
that's right.
We're going to be talking about Aethiopes. We're also going to be talking about the new album from Daniel Rossen. We are going to be talking about You Belong Here, You Belong in There, You Belong...
You Belong With Me.
Sure. That's the one.
Yes.
Fucking grizzly bear fella.
Yeah, exactly. So we will be talking about those today. And also stick around for Tuesday's video, where we're going to be talking about a very podcast core album on our record club, which is Porcupine Tree's Fear of a Blank Planet. That's going to be a good one too. So, and we've had some pretty good videos drop in the last week, if I do say so myself. Most notably, Jake and I did a video on our favorite underappreciated guitar solos that dropped on Thursday. Really proud of that video, especially considering how quickly it came together and how satisfying it was to edit in. And I really enjoyed that video. I think I'm liking the fact that our Thursday slots are offering us opportunities to do things that are a bit different than what we normally do. So check that out if you haven't already. Yeah, exactly. That was a really, really good video. But we're back today to talk about these two new records. And of course, today we are joined by special guest Brett for his second appearance on a main episode of the podcast, third appearance overall, joining us to talk about these two fantastic new records today. We're, of course, delighted to have Brett back.
Thanks for having me again. I'm very excited about talking about these two albums.
Absolutely. But before we even do that, let's get into what we have been listening to for the last 7 days. So, Jake, what have you been listening to?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I'll be able to match that kind of energy, but I think the first thing that I'm going to talk about is something that I'm glad August is here this week, because I listened to a little album that he talked about that I happened to listen to and have been listening to nonstop ever since I listened to it initially. That being the Long Blondes album, Someone to Drive You Home. This album slaps. I fucking love this thing. This is an absolute fucking heater, fucking great sort of post-punk revival, indie rock, kind of indie pop album. Very, I think I at one point compared it to Los Campesinos, specifically the song Separated by Motorways. I felt like a lot of kinship with the bands between that. And
real shit.
And like, honestly, this is just so fun. I love the lead vocalist of this band. She's incredibly emotive. She's incredibly expressive. She, the lyricism is wry and biting and cutting and funny. The whole album really, I mean, is underrated, I think, in terms of how like well written it is. The thing that I sort of discovered about it, the more I listened, is that it's really just, it has a narrative arc to it. It's sort of like a quasi concept album that's sort of charting the course of this really weird toxic relationship that's really one-sided at the behest of one character who, for the most part, is talking to another character about this relationship throughout like most of the tracks. And then there are some songs that are about these two going off and doing things and like trying to forget about the relationship and whatnot. And it's a lot of fun. It's an absolute blast. And I don't know why more people don't like talk about it, why it's not a more widely beloved record, just because it's as instrumentally proficient as anything you'd want out of this particular scene. I think the guitar work in particular is just genuinely extraordinary stuff. Like, you just don't get stuff that is this very obviously excellent but well integrated into like its very poppy sensibilities. It's just such a smart record, and I've been unable to like really put it down for even a day. I've been listening to like multiple songs from it basically every day.
I'm so happy this hit home for you, because I knew it would, and it's so satisfying that other people like me are just like, wow, this is fucking great.
I will be probably joining the choir next week. I just downloaded it on SAULT because I keep meaning to do that.
Yes.
Although when I did that, because I'm so fucking out of it, I typed in something to write home about, which is the name of the Get Up Kids' most famous album, not the Long Blondes. So it'll take me a while, I think, to remember that title, but I'm definitely going to listen to it.
4 Non-Blondes, and I was just like, wait, what?
I had that same thought every time I think of this band name. I think of 4 Non-Blondes. It's like
I think that like this is not a hard album to get into, specifically because the first 3 songs on it are like fucking perfect. Lust in the Movies is a great album opener. Once and Never Again is one of the catchiest songs I've ever fucking heard.
My God.
And then it's so good. And then the third song, which gives you a great insight to this movie's fucking sense of humor, is because it's named after a Jim Jarmusch movie. It's Only Lovers Left Alive.
Oh wow.
And it's also so fucking catchy.
And it's named after a Jim Jarmusch movie, but coming out over a decade before that movie was released.
Another thing I compared it to is the song You Could Have Both is like, honest to God, the indie garage rock revival version of Meatloaf's 2 out of 3 Ain't Bad. Like, hand to God, that's exactly the same energy. Like, a lot of this album is kind of written with the sort of Gin Stymony sensibility of like how theatrical it is. But like, yeah, it's terrific. Everyone I know would like that album, I think. Something I want to shout out is I've been listening to a little bit more of an album that I shouted out at the end of last year, like the very, very end. And that being the artist Lustmord, who I don't know what nationality he is, but if you recognize the last name specifically, I uncovered something about him, is that he did the soundtrack to Paul Schrader's movie, First Reformed, which I did not know, but yes, which makes perfect sense to me because all of his music sounds exactly like that in a very good way. The album I mentioned at the end of last year was his album Heresy, which I think is just still, like, I've been spinning that on and off recently, and that's just, again, it is an album that is so encompassed in apocalyptic doom. It just sounds like you're on an alien planet as it's tearing itself apart, and it's like you're like witnessing something out of like the Bible. It's fucking nuts. And it's like, it's really like stark and big, but also comparatively like minimal, but it sounds enormous. And I listened to The Place Where Black Stars Hang, which is a similarly well-regarded album, which is like a little bit more space ambient kind of stuff. It's a little bit more fuzzy, works with some more distorted and busier sounds, and I also really, really enjoyed that. I just really, really am into this dude, and I want to listen to more of his stuff, and hell, maybe check out more of his soundtrack work, just because I also similarly really love the First Reformed soundtrack. And a tie into the video that we made recently, I gave a re-listen to Rush's Grace Under Pressure, because one of the guitar solos on that album made it onto that video, courtesy of Mr. Alex Lifeson. We put the solo from Kid Gloves on there, which Ryley got to talking about that album with me, and then I was just like, fuck, gotta listen to this shit again. And yeah, I mean, that's always been one of my favorite Rush albums, right up there with shit like Hemispheres for me. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but the way they blend, that traditional Rush virtuosic sort of bouncy prog rock sound with the new wave instrumentation on that, it's like the perfect balance for me. That album still sounds like, especially the remaster, just, oh, it sounds so fucking good.
Honestly, like, and this is no diss to the records before it, but the run specifically from Permanent Waves to Power Windows is like, it is exactly my shit. And it's like a succession of albums that do that so well.
It's so good. It's just
really
one of
is
the best things ever.
Yeah.
There's nothing below an 8 in that run. Let's make that
fucking
clear.
right. And I also think that Red Sector A might be the best Rush song. I'm just continuously, like, I keep going back to that one, and my God, what a majestic piece of music. Also just I think something that people take for granted about Grace Under Pressure is how kind of bleak of a record it is. Like, there are definitely parts on it that aren't like as they aren't like, downtrodden or anything, but it's like, that's a song about the fucking Holocaust, and there are other songs on there that
That's
are just
got After
also
Image, right?
Yeah, After Image is on there too. And even Kid Gloves is sort of a bittersweet song that's, you know, talking about the process of learning and to have to actually properly enjoy the you know, interesting and cool parts of life, but you know, you have to, you know, do something, put on those fucking kid gloves.
And it opens with Early Distant Warning. Jesus.
Oh
yeah, it's a very like it's a very Cold War era album. Like it reflects its time in the 80s a lot, maybe more than any of the other Rush records from that time. It's just so fucking good. And like when I put on Kid Gloves to prep for our video, like, and this is just a deep cut in this album. Even you said this, Jake. It's not even like near the top echelon of the record, but like you put it on and instantly you just hit with that. It just sounds so amazingly iconic to me. And it's just a deep cut. Like it just has this sound and this whole vibe and atmosphere and production and aesthetic that's just so like, you know, instantly just from listening to this band's deep cuts during this era, this is one of the best bands of all time. Like they just switch it on, and it's like just words fail me. It's so good.
This album also ends with like Between the Wheels, which is one of my other favorite Rush songs. Like,
I'm telling you. It's like
so
people, I'm so glad I'm on a podcast with fellow defenders of 80s Rush, just because like, yeah, not all of it is to the level of, you know, their early shit, sure. But I mean, shit like Grace Under Pressure and Power Windows and Signals, like you just like the people who think that they like, you know, it's not quite as good. Nope, not true.
You know what? The four of us, me, you, August, and Morgan, we need to do like a Rush discography breakdown. Like, but we could maybe do it in like 2 parts and do like the first half and the second half.
We should probably do it in phases, honestly.
We should
do it in like their initial run of stuff and then the 80s new wave. Maybe decades even would be the best way to do it.
I mean, combining, I think, the 2000s and 2010s, because that's 3 albums.
Yeah.
I'm like the pleb that's only listened to Moving Pictures.
Hey, Moving Pictures is still my favorite Rush record, so no shame in that. Like,
it's just like one of those bands where I feel like I'm missing out on a lot of good stuff just because their other albums are talked about very highly, but I don't really hear many songs from them. So that's something I gotta deep dive into.
What I would say is if you really love Moving Pictures, just listen to the next 2 or 3 records after it. Signals, Grace Under Pressure, like they're the same sort of combination of synthier sort of new wave sounds and prog that Moving Pictures masters, and they just do it basically just as well for another few records. And then you can go backwards if you want to hear like the more pure prog rock stuff they were doing in the 70s. But Moving Pictures was kind of like the transitional point where they kind of started to incorporate more new wave sounds into what they were doing.
And look, this is a big undertaking I'm going to lay on, but I think really the best way to listen to the Rush discography is in order, because they've got one of the most impressively like apparent progressions in terms of where they're taking their sound. This isn't like some Meshuggah bullshit where it's like, oh, they played a G7th instead of a G8th on this one song. Holy shit.
Fuck.
Yeah.
Well, Rush is also a great band to get into just because like they're progressive rock, but their albums are really short. Like
I was going to say the same thing.
Is like less than 40 minutes. Like fucking like most of their great albums are less than 40 minutes, frankly. So it's not a difficult.
Every record they did up till like in their first like initial golden run up until Power Windows is like a 40-minute album max. And even some of their later albums that are longer are like still really good. But
I mean, album length doesn't really matter to me as long as just like it's a good album.
Yeah, they just mastered the format of just doing the 40-minute 8-song album.
I mean, they built for vinyl LP records, and they use those limits so consciously that like, I mean, I believe the maximum you can do without any form of compression at all on a vinyl is like 38 minutes, and lo and behold, they have a record that's exactly 38 minutes long.
Yeah, they definitely, like, one of the other things I think is really appealing about them and getting into them is that fact that they put like fidelity of sound so high up in terms of like making sure all their records sound amazing. And they're like the only prog band, I think, or maybe not the only one, but the first one that come to mind that never during that like vinyl era ever succumbed to the let's just do a double album thing. Like Genesis, yes, like all these great bands made the bloated 80-minute, 90-minute record. And look, I love them. I love those records a lot of the time. But I respect the restraint that Rush always exercised, within the vinyl era anyway.
It's probably because Neil Peart was just like, guys, I can't fucking play for longer than 40 minutes. Like, I'm literally the best drummer who's ever lived. I can't do this.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, moving on.
I guess from one prog band, beloved prog band to another, is that the last thing I'll talk about here is that I've been listening to the sort of huge compilation of every single studio album and a couple of other things by the Mars Volta called I forget what this is called every single time, but it's the compilation that was released last year with the whole box set thing that was the Tremulant EP alongside the sort of quasi demos of their first album, Deloused in the Comatorium, and all of their studio records. And I think that's it. And it's called
Landscape Tantrums.
Yeah,
No,
Landscape Tantrums.
Yes.
The compilation itself is called La Realidad de los Sueños. Don't know what that means in Spanish, but yeah, that's what it's called. And I've been listening to this primarily because all of the albums were remixed and remastered for this pressing of the vinyl, and thus the compilation itself sounds different. And as a fan of the band, and as someone who is friends with everyone who is fans of the band, I'm like, I got to check out how these mixes sound. And, again, my weird ear for production is not exactly the best gauge of this, but I can say what I thought, in that I definitely would give these a listen if you are a fan. I don't necessarily think like say Morgan, for example, his issues with the first album, Deloused in the Comatorium, production wise, probably aren't going to be remedied, but at least when I listened to them back to back just to see if I could get what was really different about the way they sounded, like down to a really, really definitive thing, it's that I could hear a lot more clarity in these mixes. I could just make out a lot more. There were just like little bass parts or just little tiny itty bitty details that I could make out that were a little bit more. You got to turn, I think it was really that they kind of scaled it back, and like, because you have to turn them up a little bit more to hear them. So I have a feeling that perhaps they sort of counteracted some of the Rick Rubinization of the mixes originally, perhaps. But that one is probably one of the more notable ones. I cannot quite say the same thing about the Bedlam and Goliath mixes, which I already think like you kind of have to tread the line of producing that album to get what it's going for. It's kind of a flatly mixed record. And they kind of change that a little bit. And I don't know necessarily how I feel about that, because it sort of dulls the impact of the instrumentation by making it more clear. So I'm not
I'll have
really
to try
sure
this
how
out,
I feel about
because
that.
the production of Bedlam is one of my favorite things about it. And
exactly,
but at the same time,
it's interesting to do just as a fan of the record, perhaps, and if you just want a slightly different experience, which I definitely think that it is. But I do think that other mixes on the album, like Francis the Mute, for example, is kind of the same thing as the first album, is that I could hear a little bit more of the instrumentation a little bit better. I think the only one that I just could not tell a difference with was Nocturnagate. Nocturnagate sounds basically exactly the same, and as far as I'm concerned, good. That's their best produced album anyway, so don't change anything, because I like the way that album sounds. So but yeah, going back and re-listening to some of my all-time favorite records has been quite lovely. So yeah, get your hands on that if you're a fan. Definitely worthwhile if you just want to hear it a little bit more. Another one I also kind of forgot was fucking Amputecture, which basically the same thing happens. Is like those mixes are really dense because the instrumentation is just so fucking heavy on that one, but you can really make out everything on that one with a little bit more clarity. So I recommend that one too. Basically all the earlier records, I think, it's kind of done a service, but they don't clean it up or anything. Like Francis the Mute still sounds kind of adequately rough. So yeah, good shit.
The Mars Volta, more like the SARS COVID. It's just
Wow.
Anyway.
Yeah.
What have you been listening to, August?
One band in particular who I know Jake mentioned last week, a group called Built to Spill. This was a band where I really did not. I was like, oh fuck, I'm this big hard ass on all this indie shit. Indie rock shit. I'm not gonna like it, and it turns out I adore it.
No, I don't think that you're as much of a hard ass on indie rock as you maybe think you are.
I feel I'm more of a hard ass than maybe I actually am. But the records
I think it's just like you don't tend to care for a lot of like indie rock maybe in the last 15 years, but before that, like so much of it is really to me seems to be so attuned to your aesthetics.
Yes.
I can already think of a bunch of records that you would love, and for fucking Silent Alarm is a 10, and that's like a seminal indie rock record. So
yeah,
go easy on yourself here.
Perhaps that's just recency bias, where I've heard more newer stuff in that style than older stuff. Anyway, focus on what I like. Built to Spill. I listened to their 2 classic albums, Keep It Like a Secret and Perfect From Now On. So really doing a 1-2 punch of I feel like shit and I want to die. Keep It Like a Secret, a little more, has a bit more of a pop sensibility to it at times, particularly those first 2 songs, The Plan and Center of the Universe, a couple other things on there.
The plan keeps
coming up again. That's a fun song. Ooh. Shit, I've been walking around campus just headphones in, shouting the fucking chorus to Center of the Universe, like
fuck yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What a song.
Waiting for someone to
say something that's right. I've gotten some queer looks, but that's fine. I don't give a fuck what they think. But yeah, that album's great. Perfect From Now On, maybe even better. Jesus, this band knows how to start an album and end an album.
Oh,
they have that to a T.
Oh.
Like Randy described Eternity, and I would heard what are you doing? Why do you want me to kill myself? And I was thinking, like, yeah, Dinosaur Jr. is obviously a big reference point for this band, and that's a revelation I had fairly recently, stupidly enough. Should have had it earlier.
I think Randy Described Eternity has like one of the best opening lines of any album, the most iconic opening lines of any indie rock album I can think of. Every 1,000 years, this metal sphere 10 times the size of Jupiter floats just a few yards past the earth. Like that to me is just such a fucking like you're in this album now. That's one of those like there are a lot of records, like other records that have similarly iconic opening lines, like Modest Mouse's Moon and Antarctica, Silver Jews, American Water. Like a lot of the best indie rock records just have like, and the best written ones just have like an opening line like that just immediately like feels instantly iconic, and that's one of the best ones.
Yeah, great records, both of them. I will be listening to this band more. So stay tuned for that. Something that you listened to last week, Ryley, was that I also listened to now was the group SAULT and their record Air. I enjoyed it well enough. I mean, this band I think has had a lot of kind of discourse around them online for their very sporadic, adventurous releases, and so I was well familiar with them. I hadn't listened to a record by them. And I liked this album enough. I thought it had some problems. I thought the recording of it varied in quality greatly. There were, like, I think the horns and brass stuff all sounds really good, really full, but then there's some percussion that I think is very thin and doesn't quite mesh with that in a way that I think kind of detracts from the record's overall atmosphere. But it was still a good listening experience. Nice thing to put on. Enjoyed it still. Yeah. a bit of a record that this was something my dad put me on. It's an instrumental hip hop album called the called Iron Horse by the group by not the group, just one guy who dubs himself the Sound Defects. And this is like one of his two records. It's the guy's last album made in 2008. After that, he just vanished. The record is very heavily focused on a very singular aesthetic of kind of evoking 60s and 70s kind of exploitation film soundtracks, kind of that funky, groovy sound with a bit more modern production and hip hop flair. It was a fine enough listen. Perhaps not the most memorable thing in the world because it does have a tone that is so consistent. It kind of finds itself unable to shake itself out of that, but so be it. And yeah, I guess that's what I've been listening to this week.
I'll shout out a few records that I have been trying out, some new records mostly. First one I want to shout out is the new record from the British spoken word poet / musician Tempest, who just put out their new album, The Line is a Curve. I'm a huge fan of Kay's previous work. Their last album, The Book of Traps and Lessons, I thought was a great melding of, again, spoken word poetry and instrumentation that gave it this sense of greater musicality than you would typically associate. It was a very unique sounding record, and I really enjoyed it a lot. And so I was very, very intrigued to check out their new album, The Line is a Curve. And this is I don't quite love it to the extent that I love The Book of Traps and Lessons, but this is a really intriguing and very unique combination of sounds and styles yet again. A lot of electronic instrumentation here, some of it quite kitschy and unconventional, and I quite enjoyed that aspect of it. And of course, Kay's poetry is as good as it's ever been. So I wasn't in love with this, but every Kay Tempest record is a unique experience. So if what I've described sounds intriguing to you, I recommend giving their music a shot. I also want to shout out that this week, a lot of really exciting and interesting new music came out. And it was a really prolific Friday release day, essentially. And so I decided, because I had a free Friday, that I would just sit down and listen to as much of it as I possibly could. And we're going to talk about a couple of records next week, but I do want to highlight a couple in particular that we may not talk about. The first of which is the new album from the Australian pop artist Hatchie, Giving the World Away. This is a fantastic record, a really, really smart and smooth fusion of sort of what you would think of as sort of contemporary indie pop, but also like 80s shoegaze infused into parts of it as well.
Huge Heaven or Las Vegas vibes from this.
Very much so. I think huge Cocteau Twins vibes for sure, and just really sharp and really strong songwriting. I didn't fully love the record from front to back. I think that its absolute high points really stood far above, but there wasn't a single point on this record where I was like, yeah, this is kind of mid. I enjoyed the record pretty well the whole way through. And there, though, again, those highlight tracks, songs like This Enchanted, songs like The Rhythm, Quicksand, The Key, Sunday Song, all really, really stellar tracks. So a record I would very much recommend checking out from an artist that I was not aware of before this record came out. So really, really, really enjoyed that quite a lot. I want to shout out the new Spiritualized album, Everything Was Beautiful, which is kind of like a companion record to their last album, And Nothing Hurt, which was a more sort of stripped down record from Spiritualized. I wasn't super into it. It didn't really, I felt like it didn't really tick a lot of the boxes of what I want from Spiritualized. But this new record is kind of like the inverse of that, in the sense that it's much more akin to the kind of classic Spiritualized records like Ladies and Gentlemen, We're Floating in Space, in the sense that it's much more maximal, it's louder, it has these really dense layers of instrumentation and orchestration that are very much in tune with the most maximalist Spiritualized music. So I think it's worth checking out for that alone. I think it is limited somewhat by the fact that the mixing doesn't give as much weight to the dense tracks here and they can kind of meld together a little bit and don't quite have the impact. But honestly, that's not a huge reservation here. For the most part, this record is really, really great, and I would highly, highly recommend checking it out. But the last new release I'll mention, and then I'll finish on a high. I'm going to talk about one of the worst records I've heard recently, and then I'm going to talk about one of the best records I've heard recently. And the worst, the record I've heard recently that was one of the worst things I've heard in a while is the new Fontaines DC album, Skinty.
I always knew this was coming.
Stinky Fia.
Now look,
did we cover this band?
We did. We reviewed their last album, A Hero's Death, and
yeah, they're the fucking
Televised Mind.
Televised Mind.
Yeah,
Televised Mind.
I love that you remember that, but you had also forgotten that we reviewed this band. It says a lot.
That's
right?
A good point.
So Fontaines DC are, for anyone who may not be aware, they're an Irish post-punk band. They, I believe, are Mercury
junk band.
They are Mercury Prize nominated. I feel like they've won, but I don't think they have. It feels inevitable that they'll win. They're this kind of band that, for whatever reason, like music press and media, just like fixate on them as like one of the staples of of the niche that they're in. And I think part of it's probably because like they present themselves, they're so like really sort of clean and smartly present themselves and smartly market themselves, and they're very sort of easy post-punk music to consume or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, this is a band with no personality. This is a band that just has absolutely nothing going on. And honestly, what's crazy about it is that they've progressively gotten less and less interesting. Like, we were pretty middling on their last album, 2020's A Hero's Death. I still think their first album, 2019's Doggerel, is pretty good. Like, I think it's a record that shows a good amount of promise. And it feels like they've kind of backed away from that into this moodier direction ever since. And on some level, I can respect it. Like, this is even moodier than A Hero's Death. This is a really kind of like, I can't think of a way of describing it without just using a pejorative, but it's a very like stripped back album for the most part. And it feels like, one thing I'll give them is that it feels like
a slur.
It feels like they are trying more and more to escape some of the conventions of post-punk and try and be like a kind of weird, quirky, sort of like unusual, moody band. Like, they're trying to go sort of in the same direction as a band like Ice Age, although I still think that Ice Age are far more interesting, even as they kind of slip away from their peak era as well. And so the thing is, like, and Ice Age are a great comparison as well, because they're another band that are just like seem to be critically beloved no matter what they do, even as they sand off, the idiosyncratic edges that once made them, intriguing prospects. But yeah, this new Fontaines DC album is just so fucking boring. Like, it's just so fucking dull. It's completely lacking in anything substantively interesting. It just has, for some reason, that single on this record, Jackie Down the Line, like, that song seems to be doing really well. Like, I've heard it on the radio, I've seen it on TV, I've seen this song being played, and it's just like, it's the most milquetoast, like, fine post-punk song ever. Like, whatever. It's so just,
if you're making post-punk and it can be played on the radio and in TV commercials and stuff, I feel like that already kind of is indicative of what might be wrong already,
And yeah, and like, the thing is, like, and I think that my biggest impediment to enjoying this band more is very much a personal thing, which is just the fact that I don't like the singer's voice at all. Like, listening to the singer's voice actively grates on me, and I don't want to say that it's because of the Irish accent, because I like you too. Like, I like,
probably because he sounds like Ian Curtis on Quaaludes.
Yeah, it's just he has a really
dull, I like you as well. Let that be said.
He has a really dull and monotonous voice. And I want to say something here, which is that dull, monotonous voices in post-punk are not inherently bad things. One of my absolute favorite modern post-punk bands is Proto-Martyr, and their singer very much sings in this monotone way where there's very little variation, but he finds a power in it, and he finds a way to make, and it helps that the band themselves are actually really muscular and compelling. But Fontaines DC are just like the most mid fucking, like, they find this middling level of moodiness, and they just never vary from it unless they want to get even more moody and middling. And it's just so, and why I emphasize this is that for some reason this record seems to be getting hailed as like their best album yet, or people who don't like their previous 2 records are like, you know, getting into this record and finding it to be like a step up. And I'm just like, dude, I don't know what you're fucking hearing, but to me, this is just so lifeless. And I'm gonna
cool, man, whatever. I'm gonna go listen to the Via Kong self-titled.
Yeah, I'm gonna talk myself in circles if I have to talk about it any longer. So I will finish my segment by talking about my favorite thing that I've heard this week. Not a new record, but it is a record that I feel like a fool for not having listened to sooner. It's a record that I know is very close to the hearts of Morgan and our podcast friend April as well. That is Ryuichi Sakamoto's album 1996. Ryuichi Sakamoto is a legendary modern composer in his own right. And 1996 is a great record because it's kind of a compilation record, but it's also sort of re-recordings as well for the purposes of this album of a number of his most like well-known pieces. So basically everything you need to hear to know like who Ryuichi Sakamoto is as a composer and his most beloved stuff is all on this record. And it's absolutely fantastic from front to back. It features fantastic, beautiful renditions of some of his most classic pieces like Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence and Bibo no Aozora, and a number of his other like most celebrated pieces are here. And it's just a fantastic way of entering the world of this amazing composer. Beautiful melodies, beautiful arrangements, gorgeous stuff. I can't recommend this enough. One of the finest works of modern classical that you'll find in the digital format. And it just absolutely, it's perfect soundtrack for just about anything as well. Like I've listened to it while grading papers and I've listened to it while playing video games. And it's for some reason, it felt appropriate in both of those settings. So yeah, this was a really, really, really wonderful collection of music. And I'm pleased to have finally gotten around to listening to it. It's the best thing that I've heard this week for sure. Anyway, moving on, let's move into our first review of the day, which is, of course, the new Billy Woods album, Aethiopes. Now, Billy Woods is an artist that we have talked about a lot on this podcast. I think I've talked about listening to certain records of his and Arm & Hammer records and what we've been listening to segments. And of course, we reviewed the Arm & Hammer record, Haram, last year when that came out. That was a very in-depth review that I gave on that record. And I think it's because Billy Woods and Elucid, who is, of course, his partner in Arm & Hammer, are rappers that have this level of intricacy and abstraction in their writing that kind of demands serious attention to unpack. And I'll be upfront, I've listened to Aethiopes a number of times this week. I feel like I'm really still missing a lot of the detail and nuance that is existing within these lyrics because they're just so dense. But I think I understand a lot about fundamentally what this record is about. And I will say off the bat that this is, I think, despite the abstraction, this is, I think, some of Billy's most compelling and just urgent storytelling and songwriting and rap writing that I've heard, certainly since the fantastic record he put out in 2019 with Kenny Siegel, Hiding Places, which was probably still my favorite Billy Woods record, but this is very, very close behind it. And yeah, so there's a lot going on here. Brett, I know that you have been paying very close attention to this record and you've been spinning it a lot and you have some thoughts on this as well. So why don't you talk a little bit about, to start us off, about what you think of Billy and what your previous sort of relationship with Billy's music was, if any, and what your kind of overall take on this new record is and how you feel about it.
Yeah, so Billy Woods, he's been somebody that I've listened to for probably a few months now only. I got into his work this year. I started off by listening to his most acclaimed album, which is not Hiding Places. It's History Will Absolve Me. And that one was, I generally enjoyed it. It was very just, it's very different when you listen to a Billy Woods album for the first time. You don't really know what you're going to get, and you don't really expect him to just barrage you with, all this knowledge and like all this, storytelling that he's putting on you. So one thing that I kind of ended up appreciating him for is just the way that he's not a necessarily preachy rapper in the way that he's, you know, kind of telling about his life and discussing things about, you know, the world and, you know, whatever topic that he's talking about, but he kind of makes you, you know, do your own research and makes, you know, you as the listener kind of, you know, make your own journey with this album and, you know, whichever one it is, and kind of, you know, make it how it is. Prior to listening to this, I only heard History Will Absolve Me, Hiding Places, and then the Haram album that came out from last year. And all those projects I really like. Now, when I first listened to this album, I was really, really excited about it because Micah, who was a guest on here, he really got me into Billy Woods too. So as soon as I put this on, I just immediately knew this was going to be my favorite project from him, just because Preservation's production on this is, it just is the perfect fit for what Billy Woods' album. And I also watched Professor Sky's review. He does a very good in-depth review of this album that's pretty much an hour and a half long. If you have the time to watch it, I highly recommend it because he goes into excruciating detail about a lot of the themes that he's talking about. But, you know, just generally with this album, kind of like didn't do my own research on it and kind of digging into it. Themes of colonialism, Black exploitation, poverty, minorities, and how it's kind of affecting his life as he is today. The first song is, this is like Asylum. This is like my song of the year, I think.
God, it's fucking awesome.
Yeah, it's just so good. I love the way that it intros with the keys, and then like these these guitars going in, and then it just kind of breaks into this like really disjointed jazz sample. And he's talking about him living his life in Zimbabwe, and then how, you know, how he thinks he's looking at African dictator. Just this whole album is just so dense and just full of these parallels to how he does everyday things, and then he just makes it to a connection about like, you know, capitalism, or about how you know, slavery is affecting how you know, the past from slavery affects how, you know, he is today. And there's just so much to go into this out that much about. But every time that I listen to something like No Hard Feelings or like Sauvage, it's just bone chilling and just absolutely enticing. Just the way that he's rapping about things like how on No Hard Feelings, he's talking about the crash of the Challenger of 1986, and how he's comparing that to the crack pandemic. He makes these incredible parallels, and I'm honestly just floored with it every time that I listen to him. He just becomes more and more of my favorite lyricist in rap right now.
Yeah, I'll say this off the bat. I'm no Billy Woods scholar, and if we do have people who are really intimately familiar with a lot of his career and his style, then I'd love to hear from them in the comments below. But one thing I have picked up on from this record, in comparison to the other things that I have heard from Billy, is that while Billy is certainly no stranger to integrating autobiographical aspects into his music, this to me feels like the most kind of personal record that I've heard from him so far. So much of this relates to his upbringing. So much of this relates to his family as well. His father was very politically involved in the Zimbabwean government, and his mother was a scholar as well, a Jamaican English literature professor. And so he had this upbringing where he was, you know, existing in this space among intellectuals, but also in close proximity to, you know, the devastating effects of colonialism and the encroachment of colonialism into intellectual space, and the ways in which, as a young child, you're shaped by that, and as an adult, you are shaped by that. And in a lot of ways, it feels like as Billy digs into these aspects of his childhood, you get certain songs on this record where he appears to be rapping from the perspective of his childhood self, and observing certain things and commenting on certain things in the environment that reflect on this way in which he's grown up and the experiences that he's had. Like, I can't get into a huge amount of detail for it, and I think that someone like Professor Sky probably would do it a lot better than me, but it's a weirdly contradictory sense of immediacy in the sense of place that he puts you in, but also the sense of distance that you have through the abstraction of the way that he describes his upbringing and he describes these situations. And he makes these elaborate metaphors, like one of the ones that you've mentioned as well, to comment on certain aspects of the way that culturally colonialism has had these flow-on effects through Africa, through America, through all parts of the world, and how he has kind of been affected and shaped by that and kind of thrust into the middle of it. It's a really powerful record for the way that he finds these really immediate and kind of incisive ways of throwing you into these scenes and landscapes that showcase directly some of the effects of those things, but also like almost try and disguise the horror through abstraction as well. Like some things are too dark and some things are too ugly for Billy to just describe to you. He has to, kind of dress them up in these elaborate pieces of wordplay. And part of it as well is, I like what you said, Brett, about how Billy kind of makes you do your own research. I think that's a great way of describing him as a rapper, is that he kind of holds a carrot out to you of this insight into this world that you, or at least certainly that we, have no knowledge of. And then when you kind of reach for that, he pulls it back and you suddenly realize that acquiring that knowledge is not as simple as taking the carrot. It's falling into the rabbit hole that the carrot is coming from, essentially, and getting lost in all of the nuance of it and all of the ugliness of it and all of the reality of it. One of the things I love about Billy Woods is that on any given project, you get a sense of the entire life of this person who has lived and been through so much and has experienced so much. You get an entire lifetime of weariness, of trauma, of relationships and observations and all these sorts of things condensed into a 40-minute experience. And for that reason, any given Billy Woods album is a lot to process. But I think that one of the reasons maybe why people are responding to this one so strongly is, for one, how immediately based around his childhood so much of this writing is, and for a second, how the production of Preservation calls attention to itself and is so excitingly avant-garde in ways that feel so heavily attuned to Billy that, for people who are into abstract hip-hop, for people who are into experimental hip-hop on the fringes, it has an immediate appeal that I think really endears it. And I think a lot of people are responding to that in particular.
Yeah, no hot takes from me or anything. I only really was familiar with Billy because of his two most recent projects, that being the Haram album that we covered on here and Hiding Places, which Ryley put on to me just because he told me that was one of his favorite records of that year. And I actually revisited that a little bit this week just because it did remind me of that record a lot. And that's an album that I just love more every time I listen to it. I just get so involved with how wiry those beats are and how like compelling of a presence Billy is. And honestly, for every reason that album is great, this album is great too, in different ways, because it's not like a insanely comparable experience. But I would say that these are two albums that are accessible, but they are still good enough at telling you why Billy is a compelling enough presence in the artistic world right now, without sacrificing basically anything. I think that there's a lot to be said about Billy as a writer and the density of his work here and how it can be endlessly poured over and searched for, and like the intangible meaning of it, and how it's still rooted in something really human and something really powerful and something really relatable too. But I think the thing that strikes me about this and what would lead me to believe it's the best of the three projects that I've listened to thus far is really of how atmospheric and involving of a record it is. It really does come down to a lot of the sound of it and to the performances of it being compelling. Is that we can talk about a lot about, we can talk about the writing on the one hand, but it's very dense and lyrical, and it's delivered in such a way that you kind of, it really does what Ryley said it does. It's kind of like it's tempting to want to do more with it, which is why it's such an incredibly compelling thing. It leads you to find out and discover more about the world that you live in. But the thing is, though, is that what's compelling about it to me, first and foremost, is actually preservation. Not to diminish anything Billy is doing on here, but from the second that something like Asylum starts, you're just kind of taken aback with how old and kind of weary this sound is, but it's not like sacrificed or diminished by the fact that it feels like you're in a decaying old jazz club or something, except everything looks like the house from the inside of Fight Club. It's like everything is falling apart and broken, and that leads this album to have kind of a ramshackle sound to it, which is not like that's not a disparagement on my account at all. But on stuff like Asylum, which I love as an opener because it kind of gets to the root of what I think this album is about in the broadest sense, and that's paranoia. It's about how every single thing around Billy, be it his younger self or his current self, or just an observation in the grander scheme of things, is affecting him, his behavior, and how he's thinking and perceiving his environment. And that's one of the cool things about Hiding Places too, is that it really builds you this really vivid environment in which you're kind of taking place in. Sort of the idea of the asylum and the home that he's talking about living in and living next to, and about living inside of his own mind lyrically on the opener. It leads you to believe that like basically all of these things are the same thing, in that Billy is talking about his own like subconscious id, and that id is this asylum, this house. It feels like a prison. These cameras are watching him. All of these things are coming together and coalescing and affecting him to the point where, a great place to hide is the sky is one of the great lyrics he has on here, which is a fantastic lyric. It's like that's the only place he can truly escape to. And that feeling of paranoia just kind of invades every single track here, and it also invades sonically in how kind of cluttered all of this can be. I think No Hard Feelings right afterwards is immediately a great kind of segue into this idea, because you're just greeted immediately to these really like blaring horns, and then Billy's just immediately on you with that delivery. And his delivery throughout the entire record is really compelling. It's really kind of, his flows are very deceptive, I think, in how kind of musical that they actually are, in that he kind of sounds like he's bordering on spoken words sometimes. But his flow, it kind of reminds me of, if I had to compare it to anybody, I'd say it's comparable to maybe MF Doom, in that he's so wordy and wiry, in that he kind of constructs his flows around what he has to say rather than maybe the opposite that I think a lot of other rappers might. And on here, it's really great just because it feels like there is a distinct rhythm to everything, even though it feels like they don't necessarily, some parts of it kind of feel dissonant with itself, which adds to that kind of level of skin crawling paranoia, that kind of crackling vinyl sound that's on a lot of the production, the kind of blaring and even occasionally fluttery synths on something like No Hard Feelings, or even something like Wharves, which is like comparatively kind of stripped back and minimal. And it's just kind of like, you just really feel rooted in this environment. You kind of hear this like bell kind of chiming in the background, and it's just really overwhelmed by static, and that kind of steady percussive beat comes in, and it's really great at making you feel like you're in like a dock or a bay out at night, and you're in like a tiny little boat that's like slowly sinking. And it's like all of these really specific environments and images that are added to not just by Billy's incredible lyricism and delivery, but by the guests. I think firstly, one of the biggest standout tracks is Salvage, which has a great verse from Boldy James, who's amazing on here verse as well. And God, man, the little beats.
Has the like
I was just about to say, the little bass lick on the beat is so fucking good on this song. It drives me crazy. It's so like, it gets into your head, and it really just kind of worms its way in there, and that kind of like ding 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 ding, and then like beeping noise. It's like all of these weird dissonant ideas are just coming together in a way that feels barely rhythmic, but still rhythmic enough to like get under you.
Yeah, Boldy I think has one of the best lyrics on the whole album in this song, which is I dug down in my soul and did some soul searching, and all I found was a police report for a missing person. Like, fuck
man.
That's fucked up line.
I had that lyric written down. It's such a good line.
Yeah,
that's like a lyric you'd fucking put in your Twitter bio or something. That's like some good. That's
a suicide note lyric, is what it is. Like
there's plenty lyrics here that are still so immediate that it makes you like, it's not all of this dense. Like we often compared Haram to like reading theory at points, and like yeah, that's definitely kind of the appeal of Haram, but also I feel like here it's the balance is just a little bit better struck. And even on something like the Doldrums, which has like a really like even more minimal beat, which I mean, like I talk about borderline on spoken word, but this track is so compelling to me just because Billy himself is still just full force as a creative presence. Really does feel like he's just at 10 all the time. Like his pen game is literally never not at 10, frankly.
Yeah.
And even on tracks like where he doesn't dominate them, like NYNEX, which has not only Elucid and Quelle Chris, but also Denmark Bessie. But like even on these songs, it still never feels like it's separated enough from Billy to feel like it's a different thing. It feels like it's almost like they act as a Greek chorus for whereas Billy is the main dialogue to what he's talking about here. And just sometimes the isolated moments, like on something like Christine, which might be my favorite song on here. The first verse of this, I have thought about this first verse so much this week. Him describing seeing something when he was a kid, black car on a back street, little me asleep in the back seat, lulled by street lamps and the blackness in between, my parents' argument picking up speed, in and out of bad dreams. That's what they said when she saw him dead in the road. Now I know it was the shadow of them black wings, unmarked, followed for us by 10 blocks. Fellas said if they try to make the stop, I'm fleeing. Brake lights, bright red, its face like a demon. We took a left, they went straight. We all laughed, but I seen it. Like, I just keep thinking about this shit over and over again, and it's just chilling. And moments like it are all over this album, infected with this kind of societal and personal paranoia that's just so interwoven that they're basically fucking all the time.
Yeah.
And even then, the sort of sonic progression of the album, I do really feel like there's kind of journey here to the point where you get to something like the last track, Smith and Cross, which is distinctly a little bit less oppressive than the rest of the album. And it really feels like you've moved from one state to the other. But as Billy kind of lyrically implies, it doesn't really feel like a relief or like the pressure has lessened. It just sort of feels like they're in a different state of being. And that's kind of what I see the title as representing, as being like, he often compares, he talks about, you know, his ancestors and immigrants and colonialism. And it's just, it feels like that no matter where he goes or where his people go, is that there's always going to be the history that followed behind them there with them. And that kind of overall looming specter feels like it dominates every verse on here, which is why I think this is just one of the best fucking albums of the year.
Yeah, one of the things I love about it is there's such an incredible sense of place in the writing, but also like Billy manages to like meld the places in which he grew up. He manages to meld like places in Africa and places in like in the US, like to the point where certain locales are difficult to distinguish, but you get a real sense of like whatever it is that is in Billy's life, whatever is hanging over him, whether it's colonialism, whether it's whatever it is kind of following him wherever he goes. Harlem, I think, is a really great track in terms of like the distinct sense of place that's evoked. The way in which he describes like these really grimy, ugly urban landscapes, and you almost get the feeling like he's describing, like he describes the projects, or he describes the suburbs like he's describing a mass grave in like a concentration camp.
Yeah,
like just there's this sense of like references to like ashes and inoculated limbs that have been severed, which has got to be an Apocalypse Now reference, and like just these really little details that paint this incredibly ugly picture. In terms of like lyricism, I think one of the standouts that you've already mentioned is Wharves, which has this like, one of the things that Billy does really, really well and reasonably consistently here is he uses words to evoke like just rotting and meat and decay and like people that are like rendered into like animals and like pieces of meat that can be like manipulated. Like he makes references to cannibal tours on this song, which is like a reference to when like wealthy white people will travel to, you know, the islands of savages to like as like a tourist thing. Like, and there's a specific documentary called Cannibal Tours that looks at that. And so he makes reference to the way in which, you know, in these kinds of environments, in these kinds of lands, you know, people are rendered as savages to be, you know, tamed, but also as these like animalistic attractions to kind of gawk at. And the way he like takes, he talks about people, whether it is Africans, whether it is Europeans, in this way that like breaks them down to these just rotting pieces of meat, like bones litter the beach, gnawed, cracked meat out of the beast's claws. Shipwrecked Europeans swimming with the virus shot out like God's semen. This incredibly evocative piece at the end of the second verse here where he's like, the swollen chiefs sit bickering while the meat crisp, the chiefs eat children, the grease drip, the meat rich. Down here it's just a muddy creek, bend and twist, the brine hiss, the fat run in rivulets, the fire spit. Like you get this incredible vivid sense of like crackling meat and juices dripping and like corpses bleeding and bones being like snapped and stuff, and it's just so violent but also like indirect in its violence, so that you don't quite know exactly what violence it's evoking, but you just get this gory fucking sensibility that's coming. It's so hard.
It's like a fucking horror movie. Like it honestly, there are parts of this album that really do make me think of Clipping, like except for that directness of the violence that you mentioned. It's like that key difference separates and makes Billy such a distinct voice, and like it doesn't make this thing that he's doing here aesthetically feel wholly derivative.
Yeah, and he does this a lot where he will use like, he'll invoke ideas of like fat and grease and like just like disgusting substances to like set a scene. Like he does it at the start of the Doldrums where it's like cold fryer full of old grease, you don't work, you don't eat. Like that is an amazing song. Essentially it's setting a scene of just like being suspended in a state of being unable to do anything, not just because you are, you know, depressed or whatever, but because like you're actually kept from, you're like almost imprisoned by your circumstances. And like he has this incredibly evocative, the lyrics in this is so fucking evocative. Like it's not really moving if it's not moving fast. Mouthful of glass, water like a mirror, cut the gas with precision scissors, bent to the task as if grave digger. When it was slow, cut each other's hair with clippers, bullets cutting through the dead air looking for victims. Like incredible sense of just like being in this like crack house environment or this like slummy environment where like, you know, the line between being dead and alive, the line between being like, you know, everything is just a miasma of, you know, oppression and suffering and awfulness, essentially. Like it's a lot to take in, and I think there's, again, I come back to that description where it's like Billy writes so abstractly because it's the only way he can convey horror effectively. I think when you just talk about things directly, awful things happening directly, then it renders them in two dimensions. It renders them something that can be easily comprehended and understood, even if it is horrific. But when you take horrific things and you render them in this abstract way, suddenly you get a real sense of how unknowable they really are, you know, in a way that you wouldn't if you just describe, you know, someone being shot and killed or whatever. Like the unknowability of horror and the incomprehensibility of horror, I think, is something that Billy is really, really good at communicating. Like one of the most evocative lines in the whole album on this song is, you know, the moon float, the horses are thrown overboard, kick fast, then slow. It don't really matter which. Like the sense that existence is futile and that you're suffering that will eventually kill you. It doesn't matter whether you fight against it or not, because in the end, the fate is the same. Like it's this, to do that. It's so fucking upsetting the way he does that, but yet it's so much more powerful than just describing, you know, hopelessness in the most blanket terms possible. It's Billy is always able to come up with an image that evokes that scene, or like describe the aftermath of something that implies, you know, a horrific event without outright kind of talking about it. There's that part in Christine where he's like, they're looking for the vehicle. They took the plates off, put it in his granny's backyard, told her something believable. He got killed. It was still there for a year or two. I'd seen it driving through. Granny on the stoop. She never waved back. Like so much about so much is not said there that, and filling in the gaps is what makes it really, and the sense of
even
lost
further
time.
in that song is there's the fucking stanza here, the asleep at the wheel, gently over the guardrail, flipped heads or tails, one died, she'd survived, asked why, I replied, God's not real, ducked the question in the hospital rooms full of flowers, I plucked the best one in a world full of cowards, it's bound to be tension. That's another one that just like this whole song, and like naming a song like this, Christine, where you're talking about the car that's like responsible for like fucking up and killing these people that you've seen and like drive the drug deals and shit, is like it's just so emblematic of what he's doing on this album and what he's doing overall in terms of the aesthetic that he's conjuring to mind. It's just so immediately arresting.
Yes, I would say probably on the song Sauvage. I mean, other than Boldy James's incredible feature, I just love the story that he's telling about this. I'm not sure if this was a kid that he maybe knew when he was a kid, but he's describing about like the scenario of like this kid. He murders his uncle because he's harassing his mother, and then he's running from the cops, and then he suffers this near fatal crash that leaves him in a vegetative state. He just like how you said, how he goes into like really almost like really gruesome, and like how on Harlem, how he's talking about how, you know, colonizers are doing things like chopping off people's hands and limbs, and they're, you know, chopping off people's heads. You know, he's comparing them to like Medusa to kind of like dehumanize these people. This is all like information that like you don't really hear talked about if you know, study, you know, kind of just like basic history details that he wants you to know about. That's really, you know, that's affected his culture for so many years. I would say probably one of my favorite moments is the song Heavy Water. I think LP has an absolutely fantastic feature on this. I'll kind of read a little bit of it. Simulation rebooters, new version. I'm gunning for light. The void's useless. It's all stab in the back. A2 brooders. Brutalist boys moving. They shooting. Nothing new. Google Chrome if you're confusing. Like that's like that is incredible. Yeah, like just that's incredible right there. But I also love how later on Billy talks a little bit more in detail about colonialism and how it's exploited and profited off of African countries, like how he says Ashanti gold on Queen Elizabeth neck, scarification across both breasts, kind of referring to how, you know, a lot of gold is actually from Africa and how they've slaughtered millions of people because of it. So he kind of compares the gold as, you know, the scarification of the people who have suffered from that. He just goes in again with like the parallels that he creates with this. He just really goes into places that he thinks that you should know, like things that you don't really hear about. A good comparison is that like Professor Sky always calls him like graduate school level rap, you know, as compared to like, you know, a college level rap, you know, like somebody like Earl Sweatshirt. But he just goes into really necessary details and really necessary events about how certain things in history, whether it be you know, things like the crack pandemic, whether it be something like he talks about how people are you know, who come to America often are poor and struggling, so they have to live paycheck to paycheck, like on the song Doldrums. He kind of just makes these comparisons to events or things that have happened in Black culture to, you know, things that are happening now, like I was mentioning before. There's other like cool little details that I think are pretty cool, like how the title Smith and Cross is a reference to a brand of rum, which obviously has ties to you know, slavery and colonialism. How the song Sauvage is a reference to the French term savage, which is what they used as justification for what they call
civilizing.
What was the word? It was civilizing. Yes, civilizing. So that's what he just uses these really brilliant parallels to kind of tie all these songs in together, including with the title Aethiopes, which in itself is an old term reference to people who aren't necessarily from Ethiopia, but from the southern region of Africa. So the way that in general, Billy has really done an excellent and very well executed job of tying in things that have kind of generate one thing that he also talks about here is generational trauma. This generational trauma that he's kind of suffered and has really brought to this really conceptual masterpiece that Preservation has really done a great job of providing a background for. This is by far and away my favorite project by him. I still have yet to visit other things in his catalog, but yeah, I mean, there's really, I'm really left speechless every time I listen to this album, because every time I do, I just find more things that I love with it, little tiny details, little things that Billy's talking about that I'll probably get a reference to later. But the more that I'll dive into this album, the more I'm just going to end up loving it.
It's a draining listen. I can't put it on casually or even listen to it all that much, but it is quite stunning. I will shout out, I think, my favorite track here overall, but particularly because I just love the instrumental, is the song Remorseless, which has this gorgeous like wailing synth sample that's just like hanging over the whole top of it. And it's just such a hopeless song as well. It feels really like it's just haunting in a particular way, whether or not you're digging into the lyricism or not. It just kind of gives me shivers just to sort of think about it. And so many of the beats and the sounds on this record kind of give off that sort of haunting vibe. And it's another great project from Billy. It's Billy doing what he does best. I think that to say that it's fine if you think this is like his best project ever, but I think to say that it's like a huge step up from anything he's done before is a little disingenuous. Not that either of you are saying that, but maybe if anyone else is saying that on the internet, I think maybe that's a bit disingenuous. This to me is just Billy continuing to do what he does best really, really, really well, and finding a really like powerful collaborator in Preservation. It's not the first time they've collaborated either. Preservation is known, I think, for working with artists like Ka and Mac Homme, and I think he's worked with Billy on his album Terror Management as well before. So it's just they find a particular groove here that really allows them to accentuate the best qualities of each of them. But it's another great Billy Woods record, and I've really, really enjoyed my time trying to unpack what I can from it, but also at the same time, it's a lot to take in. It's difficult to listen to at points, and exercise caution, I think, but still definitely check it out.
Yeah, it's just so fucking intoxicating, and I think it just does a great job of kind of riding the line of being like, it's always, if it's done well, it's going to be something that by design is going to be difficult to listen to, but it's also something that has enough sonic intricacies and things about it that I just find so captivating and compelling that it just kind of brings me back kicking and screaming whether I want to or not. And it makes it just one of the best things I've heard all year so far.
Absolutely. Well, Jake, why don't you kick us off with the ratings?
All right. My 3 favorite tracks on here. I think I'm going to shout out Asylum. I'll shout out Proto-Evangelium, primarily because it's a great song, and also because it has my favorite line on the album, which is "Life gave me lemonade, I pour my spirit of choice." And my other favorite song on here, which is probably Christine. And my least favorite song, which is still a really good track, but I think I would probably say the Doldrums, maybe, just because I find it maybe the least compelling from a production standpoint, even though it's just not a significant different quality at all. It's just that everything else around it's better. And yeah, I think I'm going to give the album a 9 out of 10.
Favorite songs, Asylum, again, song of the year for me right now. I'll also say Sauvage, and I'll say the song 9X. Proto-Evangelium is pretty close in there, just because one of my favorite lines in that song is when he says, "You're trying to pay the rent, but that's not Black empowerment. You're just trying to pay the rent." I think that song is great. Yeah, I think that's a great one. But least favorite, if I really had to choose one, probably Remorseless. But even with that, this is getting a 9.5 out of 10 for me.
My 3 favorite tracks are Remorseless, Christine, and Sauvage, probably. I genuinely don't think I have a least favorite track. I think that there's really nothing that's any measurable step below the majority of this record. But it coasts a really good, even consistent line for me. I'm going to give it an 8.5, which means that we get an average of 9.0 for Billy Woods and Preservation's Aethiopes. Let's move into our second main review of the day, and this album is, of course, the new album from Daniel Rossen of Grizzly Bear, You Belong There. Now, this is Daniel Rossen's debut solo record, I believe. Grizzly Bear are a foundational 2000s indie rock band, and they are known, I suppose, for being one of the 2000s foundational indie rock bands that lean more in the kind of Baroque direction of having these kind of like more complex musical arrangements, more sort of musically sophisticated, I suppose you could say, but also having quite a kind of core pop appeal. I think with 2009's Academist, they kind of hit a peak of sort of cultural relevance. They had a huge hit song on that record called 2 Weeks, and that's a really great album. But not even their first great album. Their 2006 album, Yellow House, is a beautiful, like sort of Baroque folk record that has a lot of amazing, gorgeous soundscapes within it. And my favorite Grizzly Bear record, 2012's Shields, is like their most poppy and kind of like intense and loud and bombastic record ever. And that's a fantastic sort of pinnacle for them. They came back with 2017's Painted Ruins, which I think is an underrated record, but still probably not quite at the high echelon level of the previous records, but it's still very ornate, very lush, very gorgeous. And this lush, gorgeous, ornate instrumentation has always been matched by the very pretty and kind of almost like seductively siren song-esque vocals of Daniel Rossen. Not the only vocalist in Grizzly Bear, but to me, the primary one, the one whose voice kind of stands out the most. And so I discovered very recently that Rossen was putting out his debut solo record with Christopher Beer, who is the drummer from Grizzly Bear. And yes, the beer in Grizzly Bear. So I was very, very intrigued by the prospect of that collaboration, because to me, Chris Beer is like, he's the special sauce that holds Grizzly Bear together. Like anyone can do cool, ornate, Baroque folk rock music. But what always made Grizzly Bear so captivating was how energetic they could be while doing that sort of stuff. And Chris Beer's percussion was a huge part of that. And so having him here with Daniel making this record was a really promising sign. And then it was even more promising to see this record get pretty immediately rapturously received. And so I went into this very intrigued, very excited, and this fucking album, man, this is fucking gorgeous. Like, no shit, right? But like, even for the standards that these musicians involved have set up for themselves, this is, I think, the best sounding record that anyone involved in this record has ever made. This is one of the best mixed and mastered rock records of the last several years, in my opinion. I can't think of one that's better mixed and mastered going back to like maybe Perfume Genius's No Shape. But even then, like, this is a very like distinct record with its own unique palette that it doesn't really variate or veer from within its runtime. But you get like, I can't think of the last time that an artist has made the acoustic guitar sound the way that Daniel Rossen does here on this record. It sounds like glistening diamonds every time he strums his acoustic. Like on opening track, it's a passage, for example, when those acoustic guitars really come in and you get that strumming. It's so fulsome. There's such like weight and depth and like genuine dimension to the acoustic guitar playing on this record, and it's so crisp and beautiful. And that's something that's true of acoustic guitar stuff on Grizzly Bear records too. But it's like my passion for these musicians is just reignited by the sound of that acoustic guitar. And Daniel is such an ornate and like sophisticated composer as well. You get a lot of beautiful and crisp and clean, but also like not super standard chord progressions and compositions that happen on this record. It's full of little surprises and little gems and little joys, and it's so immaculately conceived. And Chris Beer, as you would expect, is just absolutely going ham on the kit, like in as much as a drummer can on a Baroque folk record, right? Like, it's not Gavin fucking Harrison we're talking about here, but that Gavin Harrison wouldn't work on a record like this. It's a different kind of great drumming. It is much more akin to some of the great jazz drummers of their time. Like, I think of drummers like Tony Williams when I listen to Chris Beer play on this. Incredible sense of muscle, incredible sense of just also a real flair for the subtle nuances of playing and for how to really make the most out of his kit and the different ways in which he can apply percussive texture to these arrangements. It's just fucking incredible. This album is like, I was reminded several times of Julia Holter while listening to this, and a lot of other kind of Baroque folk, sort of abstract folk artists. But Daniel has this incredible talent of taking some of those aesthetics and infusing them into really catchy, really memorable, and just really beautiful songs. It doesn't have the way out kind of weirdness of some of the other artists that we might have talked about in the past that do this kind of music. But what it doesn't do with that, it makes up for in just sheer beauty. I mean, this is one of the most beautiful albums of the year so far, I think, too. I've had this one on rotation a lot this week. It is a really, really special record.
I've never been familiar with Grizzly Bear's work before this. Kind of going into it, I heard a lot of buzz about it, so I was really excited to hear this. And yeah, I completely agree. This is absolutely gorgeous. The guitar playing on this album was really what drew me in, just because on some of these songs, I mean, you can kind of see in the background, I have Elliott Smith right there. I can really sense his influence on some of the guitar melodies that he puts into this, like on the first track, It's a Passage. But I also kind of sense like this past love yearning, kind of like dealing with like a different relationship and how he kind of connects with like the wilderness around him. And it really does have like this really like serene, picturesque, you're kind of like skydiving through the Appalachians or something like that. It just has a really just cinematic quality to it. And I just love how each track just sounds like that, and it just doesn't really let up. I think one of my favorite moments on the whole album is probably my favorite song actually is the song Celia, just because I love how just the bareness of just having him singing with just like just really minimal instrumentation behind him, and then there's like some vocal harmonies that come in by you. I get a sense of like this, like the song Copenhagen by Scott Walker a little bit. It just has that quality to it, and every time that I put this on, it kind of just relieves any like stress from my brain. It kind of just puts me like right in the middle of just like the wilderness, and it kind of just has this escape that I think Daniel is kind of trying to evoke with this, like him dealing with the something like on It's a Passage, where he's kind of talking about a past relationship, how he kind of like explores this idea or like this scene and kind of just gets lost in it and kind of just I guess relieves his pressures from it.
Absolutely. He's a very evocative writer, and yet every time I sit down to like pay attention to what he's saying, I just get so lost in the instrumentation for me. I think I was kind of primed to really love this because I've been listening to so much Adrian Lenker and Big Thief lately. And this is very much a record that I feel like will appeal to people who really love Big Thief and who just like, folk rock with a focus on like compositional complexity and interesting chord arrangements, and also just a beautifully lush and fulsome sound. I think that's the kind of chief appeal here.
I definitely see what you mean when it comes to like the sound of all of it. The vocals also really reminded me of the Antlers, Peter Silberman. I mean, like, it could be him for all I know.
Yeah.
There's a real similarity there,
especially on like It's a Passage and shit. I was just like, damn, is this fucking in the attic of the universe? I mean, goddamn. So I mean, all the parts here in isolation are just really solid shit. Like, again, the way it sounds, it's an immaculate, lush, really, really enveloping recording, and the vocal performances are really captivating, if a trifle one note, I find. I've kind of struggled with my thoughts on this just because it is a very consistently pleasant, well put together, well arranged. I think a lot of the depth and size of a lot of these songs kind of took me off guard, but it was just, I kind of struggled to feel much from the experience, I guess. I mean, I really like stuff like It's a Passage. It really communicates the feeling of a journey, both in its kind of structure and lyrically. I'm still not totally sure about how abrupt the ending kind of feels. I do really like Shadow in the Frame, though. It's not totally unlike something that you would hear on an earlier Deer Hunter album, like Deer Hunter as in the prog Deer Hunter band, not Deer Hunter. But right when it comes to the expressiveness of the vocals on this track specifically, which are what lead me to kind of latch on to this one specifically. The title track is really incredible. I really love how tense the arrangements feel here and how jazzy the breakdown at the end feels. And on Unpeopled Space, it kind of oscillates between being one of the sparser tracks on the album and one of the busier ones. And frankly, I'm not really a huge fan of either. I just, this is kind of one track that specifically leaves me a bit adrift. Celia, I do actually really like this track and how it feels tonally. The ascending chord progression that kind of comes back over and over again and then just kind of halts and sort of submerges you in like a miasma of vocal harmonies is really fucking cool. I like the wild. Oh yeah, it's super awesome. I love the wild and jazzy pianos that kick off Tangle rather. It's kind of layered in with like a menace that's seldom found in progressive folk. It doesn't really develop into much that wholly captivates me specifically, but I still like it overall. I don't like dislike anything on the album.
That was the song that reminded me the most of Julia Holter, actually. Tangle was just, and I think it's something to do with the particular free jazzy aesthetic of it. I really love the moments on this record where it gets super like unconventionally structured in terms of what the songs are like, and I think their highlights for you too is the next two tracks after Tangle as well. I think really encapsulate this really well, and I think are the peak of the record.
Oh, totally. Completely agree with you on that one. I really like the I'll Wait for Your Visit is like one of the most dynamic and ornamental tracks on here. It's the kind of thing that you really want to get lost in while listening to it. And then Keeper and Kin is by some margin my favorite thing here. It's
same
absorbing, lush, fuck yeah. It's a lush piece of folk that ebbs and flows like a lake in a steady autumn breeze. The way the lyrics kind of invite the subject to just sort of stop and take everything in and enjoy the world around them just serves to like pull me in further. The progressiveness of the progressive folk in this track is really felt. And I also really like the last one. In fact, to the point where I kind of wish it was the closer of the album, as it rings with a kind of finality and that closure, finality and a closure that I don't really think Repeat the Pattern quite has. But the way this instrumentally rises and lifts with the distant guitar chords that sound like they could be found on like an early Beach Boys or Beatles track is just kind of incredible. And Repeat the Pattern is a decent song, but I really like the kind of wrenching final line of it. But I feel like the thematic closure found here could have kind of been seamlessly put into the previous track, as I find the first half of this a trifle meandery, but like it might sound like I'm a little bit more negative than I am on this overall. I really do enjoy it. I just, some parts of it just don't fully click for me, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, I probably would agree with that actually, with the final track feeling a little bit superfluous, but generally speaking, I'm just so taken with the whole atmosphere of the whole thing that it kind of just feels like one holistic thing. I don't so much pay attention to the distinctions between songs. Like for the first couple of times I listened to this, like I didn't realize when It's a Passage ended and Shadow in the Frame started. Like they just kind of run into each other, those two songs, and I kind of appreciate that. Actually, and
a couple songs do that.
Yeah, and I dig that aspect of it as well. Like it's a very easy record to sort of get lost in. Like,
yeah, I was actually gonna say the song "I'll Wait for Your Visit." I definitely I love like how psychedelic and also at the same time complex. How it's just like constantly shifting moods with each key. I will say I do kind of agree. Repeat the Pattern is a little bit of a bummer of an ending. I do still think I do think it's a pretty good song overall. Also kind of digging into the lyrics a little bit. I kind of got like the sense that he's kind of like welcoming his his newborn child into the world, saying that like, hey, this is like the world around me, and like this is, you know, where I live, you know, I can't wait for you to see this world. So kind of with the few tracks that I kind of actually dug into the lyrics, I found like what he's actually talking about, and how the music behind it actually matches that is was a really good choice with that. I will say also as well, I really do like the song Unpeopled Space. Just the like the whole jazz inspired kind of like folk melody that, you know, again, feels very cinematic and very you know, landscape-ish. I guess that's a word I can use to describe it. But he also kind of uses this song to kind of talk about how he was I guess like cutting bushes in his yard, and in the process kind of came to a realization that this is kind of like how it's kind of like a meta thing that he kind of describes how he's using this as a way to describe how he is as an artist, you know, because he tries to like cut his bushes in like a certain way to where it looks good, but then, you know, he keeps failing. So he kind of uses that as a way to kind of juxtapose it to the idea of how an artist, you know, constantly tries and fails for a good final product, but eventually comes to a you know, a satisfying final product after lots of hard work. So I really enjoyed that.
That's a beautiful like observation, actually. This idea of art as like not actually being a blank page that you then construct, you know, the art on top of, but actually like thinking about it more like sculpting a marble, where art is just like the thing exists and you like have to carve away at the extraneous information to like get to the art and make the art and using the kind of cutting away at the bush and stuff, and like as a way of a metaphor for that. That's a gorgeous way of imagining art, as like being more like sculpture, like maybe like not art in general is too vague maybe, but like composing music is maybe being more like sculpture for him than like painting, where you're actually like all of the sounds exist and you just have to like sculpt out the perfect vision of them, and like take away figure out all the stuff that doesn't belong until you're left with this distilled like perfect vision of it. And I can relate to, even though I don't make music, I can relate to that approach in terms of like creation, in terms of like I have all of the things I want to put out there, whether I'm editing a video or whether I am like writing something or something. I have all of the information, but I have to sculpt away at the things that are extraneous, at the things that are kind of holding it back, and find the perfect vision that's already there beneath all of the noise. And that's like, not only is that a beautiful way of thinking about approaching art or approaching creating music, but it's also like a beautiful way of thinking about living. A beautiful way of thinking about living your life is about like carving away all the bullshit and finding the, you know, the contentment, the decent life that is already existing, but is just like so covered with shit that makes it like hard to see. And you just have to living is finding a way to carve away those pieces of extraneous bullshit and extract the already existent, you know, happiness inside. What a tangent that is, but like, yeah, it's I think that idea is in here, the idea that everything you want, everything you need, the vision already exists, and the journey is finding it, not like having to create it out of nothing. Anyway, good album, really love the album, good music. Favorite tracks and ratings. First up, I'll go. My favorite tracks are going to be Keeper and Kin. I agree with Jake. That is the best song here. One of my favorite songs of the year, actually. I've listened to this song so much. Second favorite is going to be I'll Wait for Your Visit. Again, that 1-2 punch of those two songs is just immaculate. And I'll also throw in Unpeopled Space. I do really love that song. And my least favorite, yeah, it's probably going to be Repeat the Pattern. I'm going to give this album an effusive 8 out of 10. I really, 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 really have been enjoying this a lot. And I would not be surprised if with more time, it goes up from there. I think this is the second best Grizzly Bear related project after Shields. And frankly, I could see it overtaking that. So yeah, definitely check this out.
I'm going to say that my 3 favorite tracks are, Keeper and Kin is my favorite on here. I'm also going to say probably I'll Wait for Your Visit and Shadow in the Frame. Least favorite track on here is probably Unpeopled Space, and I'm going to give the album a 7 out of 10.
Awesome. And Brett?
Okay, I'm gonna go 3 favorite tracks. Passage, I'll go with Celia, and I'll also say, why not? I'll say I'll Wait for Your Visit too. And least favorite, I'll also say Repeat the Pattern too. But this is gonna get right in the middle of both of you guys, 7.5 out of 10.
Alrighty, so that is an average of 7.5 for Daniel Rossen's You Belong There. Let us know at home what you think of either of the albums we've discussed today, Billy Wood's Aethiopes and Daniel Rossen's You Belong There. We want to hear your takes, we want to hear your opinions, we want to hear what you think, and if we missed anything in our discussions of these records, especially the Billy Woods album, which is so dense, if you have any interpretations or additional thoughts you want to add on to what we've said, please hit us up in the comments below, and we'll be very responsive to your comments. If you enjoyed the video, if you enjoyed the podcast, then make sure you hit the like. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music, head on over to the YouTube link in the description. Give us a like there. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Both of those things really help us out and would mean an awful lot to us. If you really enjoy what we do and you want to support us even more, you can hit the join button on our YouTube page, and for just $1 a month, you can support the channel, get yourself entitled to perks such as having your name featured in the title call of every video on this channel, getting priority comment response, and if you want to recommend us a record to listen to, then we will put your recommendation at the top of our listening pile. So yeah, those perks are there if you're interested. As always though, folks, until next time, rock over London, rock on Chicago, General Electric, imagination at work.